Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Happy holidays to everyone, and just bear with me while I get the links posted. Brian will entertain you with a fun jig or maybe some di- um, keys jangling or something. Well, you have to remind us all why we keep you around, other than the fact you actually know what you're talking about,
Mm,
because you do. But there is that all valuable keeping the audience entertained while I handle the technical boring stuff.
yeah, the distraction factor.
Yep. So let's see. da, 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 da. Yes, just going back to Facebook to post and the link about the great, fondly remembered real Al Yankovic. We should take a moment of silence because of his untimely death in '85 because of not Marilyn Monroe, Madonna.
Madonna, yeah.
Curse you, Madonna!
Yes, leader of the South American drug cartel.
And anyone who's confused by this discussion really needs to watch the movie Weird, the Al Yankovic story. Not right now, because right now you should watch the show. But after the show, you should actually go watch my new channel where I'm doing a live, well, a recorded now playthrough of um Wrath of the or Shadow of the Dragon Queen, which everybody can find at by going to Dicing with Dragons. I'll put a link in the description after the show. Um, should be a weekly kind of thing. Lots of fun. For those of you who are familiar with the Dragonlance world, keep in mind the the tagline for this series is "When the shadow of the Dark Queen falls, the Kender will rise." Because I have been insane enough to have allowed of my three out of the players in my party are playing Kender. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking either, but it's fun. It's absurd. Should make for a good campaign. And I am almost done posting, and then we will be on topic,
Mm,
or at least as on topic as we usually are.
yes. Me.
Okay, there we go. We are ready to go now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Tonight we are going to be making lots of references to Monty Python. For the Paranormal Encyclopedia channel is a silly place, and we will be also we will happen to be talking occasionally about King Arthur and the Holy Grail and the Knights of the Round Table and Merlin and all of those other things that we've alluded to more than once on the show over the years, but never get around to actually talking about in any depth. For those of you unfamiliar with us, let's do the introductions. My name is Kevin Mears. I'm a demonologist, paranormal investigator, and the titular Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am joined by my co-host
Brian McKinley, godfather of vampire thrillers, author, and all around writer type person.
and nerd like myself.
Yes, very big nerd.
Yes, it's like nope. There's no deny. I mean, we're talking about King Arthur, and we're talking about, and we're making lots of Monty Python references. It's unavoidable at this point. Um, I was also going to say, funny enough, I once upon a time had a good friend who was a medievalist
Mm.
who confided in me once that Monty Python and the Holy Grail is a favorite movie among people who study King Arthur.
Oh, I'm sure it is. There are so many sly, very intelligent references to
Yep.
very big and important things that just fly over most people's heads in that movie because the Pythons were incredibly smart comedians.
I mean, they were Cambridge. They met it while they were students at Cambridge, for God's sakes.
Yeah, they were all highly educated. I mean, John Cleese was a Latin teacher before joining the comedy troupe. So these are smart people that had very smart humor woven in among the silliness.
Which actually reminds me of something I learned today, this morning, in fact. Apparently, 42 cups of coffee at once, or in quick succession, obviously, qualifies as a lethal dose.
Oh yeah.
So we have finally figured out the ultimate question. How many cups of coffee constitute a lethal dose? 42. And given how much of the world depends on its daily dose of coffee, this is clearly the question. And
Of
the
life,
world
the
does
universe,
indeed
and
make more
everything.
sense once you know that.
The answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Exactly. I mean, it's 42.
What do you do?
The nerds have known it all along, and science has now confirmed it. So where do we start with King Arthur? Yes, the
Uh,
most interesting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to suggest. Like I said, I was looking into this stuff earlier and found some interesting stuff. So if you want, I could talk a little about the earliest ideas of Arthur
Yes.
that
Why don't you do that? That's an
and,
excellent
and
idea.
and where things kind of changed and started to give us the modern idea of Arthur. So, okay, apparently Arthur seems to originate in like the 5th or 6th century and is primarily Welsh and Britain.
Mm-hmm.
The Britons, of course, being kind of the Romans who stayed behind after the Roman occupation ended and became kind of locals and set up their own culture and fought the Saxons and all that kind of stuff later on. So Arthur kind of came out of that. Arthur is kind of actually a Roman name, or at least Arturius is, and is thought to be the one. Well, is one of. There's a bunch of different theories as to how the name Arthur was originated from and where it comes from and whether it's from the Latin or whether it's from a Welsh word or whether it's from a title or whether it's from a constellation.
Well,
There's
yeah, the eternal question of did Arthur exist?
yeah. So apparently in the earliest traditions, Arthur is kind of a almost like a Greek demigod more than what we think of him now as kind of a traditional monarch or king.
Mm-hmm.
He was just kind of this badass warrior that would go around with his crew of awesome
Other
dudes.
badass warriors.
Yeah, slaying monsters, and there was a lot of apparently him traveling to and from the other world.
There's a big thing with him hunting a giant boar, I want to say as well.
Yes, yeah. There's a in Welsh. It's got a name, but I can't pronounce it. It's something with two T's. It's like Tiernan or something like that. But there's a whole Welsh story behind that. It's very famous. But yeah, Arthur would also kill giants. He would kill big supernatural cat creatures. All of that. Bedivere, known as Bedwyr, and Kay were both early parts of his story, even back then. So those are two of his knights that have a very long pedigree and kind of go back to the original
Wasn't
tales.
Gawain one of the older ones? Or like
A little
originally?
later, yeah, Gawain was also somebody that was mentioned as one of Arthur's knights. Apparently, in some poem or something, they list something like 200 of Arthur's knights or guys.
Which tracks, even though Morte d'Arthur says there was 160 knights of the Round Table.
Yeah, yeah, but this is all way before any kind of
Or yeah,
Round Table or Camelot or any of those myths, and certainly long before Lancelot, because he was added by the French.
yep. He was French. Parsifal is German. Galahad is also French.
Yeah,
And pretty much every culture in Europe, and then some, added to Arthurian legend at some point.
yeah,
There's
because
Russian stories. There's even a few that involving Middle Eastern knights.
he's kind of one of the original kind of breakout characters that
Yeah.
really became worldwide popular. Part of that seems to be, or a lot of that seems to be attributable to Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was the first guy to really write down in any English version or Latin a story of Arthur, and he's the one that really made Arthur kind of like King of Britain and gave him all of these sort of trappings that he later came to possess. And he's the one that first started, but he wrote him like as if he was a historical king,
Yep.
and wove his story and his father and Merlin and all of that into a legitimate history of the kings of England, which was interesting. And I've heard one of the reasons he may have done this was to win favor with Henry II and the sort of Plantagenet, the early
Mm-hmm.
Plantagenet dynasty, royal family, by kind of giving them this weird kind of spiritual
Heroic, epic.
connection, yeah, to Arthur, and that may have played into kind of the propaganda. But Monmouth's work
Probably just
was,
given the reality of historical politics.
oh yeah, and Geoffrey of Monmouth's work was very well regarded and was printed and reprinted in lots of languages all over the world for hundreds of years. So he was probably the most influential single person in the creation of the Arthur myth. And then later you have more writers adding chivalry elements and romantic elements. And what's interesting is, as it seems like as it goes on,
Mm-hmm.
they mention that one of the odd things that happens is Arthur himself actually kind of becomes less and less important in his own story as time goes on. It starts
Well, yeah,
becoming all about the other people. It becomes all about Lancelot
and
and
Galahad.
his cuckolding of Arthur
Yeah,
with Guinevere, and Arthur just becomes kind of weaker and weaker as a character, where originally he was almost like
this epic
Hercules.
badass.
Yeah, he was like Hercules or something. He was this guy who dispatched like hundreds of enemies and single-handedly
There's actually a
slaughtered dragons.
theory in terms of the origins of the story that it's a Christianization of an old Hercules cult
Hmm.
brought over by the Romans, which
That's
partly ties
possible.
in, like you said, to him being this warlord type character who ran around the countryside killing fighting and killing dragons and giants and
Yeah, what's
wild
funny is
boars.
there is a thing in the Welsh and Britain tradition of like Arthur actually doing something similar to some of the 12 labors of Hercules, like sort of being challenged to take on these great tasks and him going out and doing them.
Yep.
And that would really fit with a bunch of Roman descendants kind of blending their stories of Hercules with the Welsh legends of Arthur, and kind of getting that sort of
Well,
hodgepodge as a
here's one of the
result.
interesting things I think. What research I've done over the years, where there's very much debate about if Arthur was a real person or not.
Yeah.
Merlin was actually not only based on a real person, he was based on two.
Uh,
Because in the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth, he actually calls him Merlin by weird spelling, but Merlin Ambrosius.
mm,
So generally speaking, one, he was loosely at least inspired by Aurelius Ambrosius, who was an actual Roman who had a political rulership of parts of England at one time.
yeah,
It was also based on a figure known as Myrmidon, who was this kind of crazy poet who lived in the woods around the 6th century.
you mean sort of like a druidic bard, like
Yeah,
a
probably like he may also just have been so. I mean, from what I've read, the references are a little vague, but there is like this historically accepted figure who was kind of seen even at the time as this crazy prophet, poet type of character who lived out in the woods, who may
yeah,
very well have been a bard. I mean, we are talking about the Celtic the time period where the Celts were big, and we're talking about England where there were lots of Celts.
yeah, yeah, and the druidic tradition stuck around for a long time, and
Mm-hmm.
having a bard was one of the stages. It's one of the like offices that you could
One of the initiations,
achieve.
essentially.
Yeah. So yeah, that I mean that makes total sense, and I've seen works where they use that interpretation of Merlin or Mirrodin or whatever they
Yeah.
call him. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of that. He definitely seems to have had some historical basis. Yeah, they really don't know about Arthur. It's like he may have actually been a king. There may have just been somebody with the same name who happened to rule, and the stories might have nothing to do with him. But yeah, there's just so little known about that period as far as any kind
Mm,
of there's some poetry that kind of exists and
my
remains,
understanding,
but that's it.
there is a general thought that Arthur is at least loosely based on one or more, because the reality is he may have been a what's what I'm looking for, composite figure that a couple of historical warlords and tribal chieftains, the stories got kind of mixed together into this single figure, which is a fairly believable idea just by for the changing nature of folklore and oral tradition.
Yeah.
Um, but I know particularly I've read that there was one of the Celtic chieftains who wanted to actually won one of the few, if not the only, decisive victories the Celts did against the Anglo-Saxon tribes, and it's thought that he may have been at least the loose inspiration for King Arthur.
Mm, yeah.
But again, as you said, we're talking about so long ago, it's impossible to know.
Well, yeah, and a period where there really wasn't much in the way of written history. It's kind of between where the Romans left off, where they kept pretty good
Yeah,
records. So you didn't have them anymore, and you didn't have the the church or scholars or any of them yet kind of picking up. So it's really this literal dark ages kind of in between those
I
time
mean,
periods.
Druids did have a written language, but it wasn't the most long-standing of method, writing methods. I want to say it was on Arc or something else that was fairly degradable.
Yeah, that and most anything of theirs that would have survived was probably burned later by by like the church or
Well, there you start
I know
getting into complexities.
Caesar did a number on the druids
This is true.
in Britain that he found.
It's like the church deserves blame for plenty, but let's not forget that Julius Caesar came along and conquered Britain long before the Jesus was born. So
Yeah, actually not.
The Romans were hardly innocent bystanders before Christianity takes over.
Oh no, that's true. Although Caesar was less successful than
Mm,
most people. Most people think it was Caesar. It was actually three emperors later,
Mhm.
Claudius, that came back and was actually successful in pacifying a large portion of Britain and establishing a true Roman foothold there. Caesar kind of came, fought some battles, and largely got driven back off the shore, and always meant to go back and
Yeah.
fight the Britons again, but other politics and
And then he happened to stop
concerns.
by Rome during March.
Yeah,
There were some Ides involved.
had to march on Rome, had to go take care of Egypt, had to fight Pompey, had to get assassinated, all that
Yeah.
stuff. But yeah, so it was actually Claudius that
Came back and
really
took care of business.
really did take care of Britain. Yeah, but not as bad. Like he was a smart emperor, and he mostly made peace and alliances with a lot of native tribes, and kind of got the Romans in that way rather than just coming
Kill them
through
all
with
and let the gods
brute
sort it out.
force. Yeah, he didn't just raise the whole country with brute force. He was very strategic and worked with a lot of tribes
And
and
it's worth
stuff.
saying for his flaws, and Caesar is hardly a saint, but Julius is actually known for having tried to document the various cultural groups he comes in contact with.
Oh yeah, he kept very detailed records, and his like campaign diaries are
Yeah.
fantastic resources for historians.
I know it's through Caesar we first hear about the Druids practicing human sacrifice, particularly the
Yeah.
Wicker Man from
Yep.
the titular movie. The main argument I've seen historians make is it's not that they didn't burn people alive as human sacrifice. It's just that it was actually more of a form of execution than just, hey, we're going to take a bunch of innocent virgins and burn them to death.
Oh yeah, it was probably for some particular crime, or
Yeah.
just the same way the Romans used crucifixion quite liberally, and not just for religious prisoners and
Yeah,
religious
it was just
starts.
their a fairly standard method of execution to the Romans.
Oh yeah, they loved crucifixion.
It just makes me think of stories of the Vikings who wound up crucifying a bunch of Christians they came in contact with. Not actually in a sense of disrespect. It's like, well, you honor this guy who was crucified and you carry around these symbols of him. Here, we'll do you a favor and kill you the same way.
Yeah, yeah, that kind of makes sense from the Viking
Yeah.
standpoint.
I
But
mean, a lot of
yeah,
this, it sounds, and let's face it, it is very brutal. But if you look at the history of what other cultures in the same time period are doing, it's fairly par for the course.
yeah, and really, it's like people think about the crucifixion part as being like, wow, that had to be like painful for your hands and stuff like that, or whatever. It's like that probably numbed out after a while. What really got you with crucifixion was just suffocation.
Yep.
You basically just suffocated under your own weight. So in that way, it might have been a slow but not as painful as you would think way to die.
Not a pleasant way, certainly, because, yeah, you slowly crushed to death under your own weight. If
Yeah,
you were lucky and the Romans were feeling merciful, they might break your legs to speed the process up.
yeah,
Although, completely unrelated, Arthur, this makes me think of the interesting detail. A lot of people talk about the nails for the hands being a mistake because your hands can't support your body weight like that.
right. Yeah, it was
First
usually
of all,
for
that's
the wrists.
first of all, that's not entirely true. There are actually a few people, and I'm not going to comment on their sanity, who try crucifixion as a form of religious observance from time to time. And you can hold more of your weight that way than than people think. But there's also the other side of that, which is the reality that if you actually look at at a crucifix, um, yes, there's nails through his hands, but his feet are not simply nailed to the cross; they're nailed to a small platform.
Yeah.
form that comes off of the cross, which would have actually borne some of his weight. Am I saying he was nailed through the hands? No, we don't really know for certain. But there is actual one. It is actually anatomically possible, and there is an archaeological argument that that may have been done. Not that it has to have been through the wrists.
Yeah.
So here, back to King Arthur, but tied into the crucifixion. Do you know where the Holy Grail first appears?
Um, yeah, actually it's in the Romance period that they start adding, like after post
But do
Geoffrey
you
of
know who
Monmouth.
first added it?
Um, let me think. I think it's on here. Uh,
No, you don't know. I wanted to see if you remembered. I actually
oh,
do know
I
off the
don't
top of my
remember
head.
why. It's not Chrétien, is it?
Yes, actually, it is.
Okay.
Pretty in Detroit first
Yeah,
added in the 11th century.
the major French influence on the legends.
But what's really interesting with Critian in Detroit is, and he is the one who created the Holy Grail.
Hmm.
There is no reference in Arthurian mythology to it before him, and for that matter, very telling. The it doesn't really appear in Christian mythology before that.
Ah,
There's certainly the sacred chalice, which was the cup that Jesus uses at the Last Supper, holds up the wine and says, "Take this and drink of it. This is my blood."
right.
Um,
But that
but
wasn't the Holy Grail.
yeah, particularly the fact is that's the extent that the Bible discusses this cup. There's no reference in the Bible to Joseph of Arimathea using it to catch the blood of Christ as he is crucified, um, or any great significance of it being brought to Great Britain, or all the magical powers and things that are associated with it.
Yeah.
And in point of fact, let's put one of my most hated conspiracies to bed right now. The original name for the Holy Grail is not Sangreal. There's a whole theory, and I use the term theory loosely, that holy blood, instead of San Real, which means Holy Grail, it's Sang Real, which means holy blood. And that in fact, the Holy Grail was originally the bloodline of Jesus Christ, kept secret for thousands of years. This is a whole lot of nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I think that that only really showed up, didn't it, in like one guy's work that was pretty well discredited, but only became popular and famous because Dan Brown decided that would make a great basis for a fictional
Yeah, but it's become such a
story.
popular idea. I've been listening to people tell me it for decades
Oh yeah.
now.
Well, that's unfortunately what happens when a story becomes part of popular
Yep,
fiction is suddenly it takes on this whole new light, just like werewolf legends
and
and
silver.
the Wolfman. You know, you go
Yep.
back before the Wolfman, and people don't realize that no, that's where like 90% of our current werewolf legends start from is that movie.
Or Dracula's in the novel, even Dracula's influence on vampire. What
Yeah,
we think
exactly.
vampires are.
Yeah, everybody thinks of stuff about vampires based on Stoker, and
Yeah.
they think this is all part of folklore. And it's like, no, most of that stuff didn't exist in folklore for any of its
Yep.
period.
But Crichton de Troyes is the first person to mention the Holy Grail. He actually calls it San Gredalis.
Okay.
Gredalis, for those of our listeners who don't know, is a plate. It's a serving dish, essentially, that you would serve one of several courses of a meal on. According to Parsifal, which is the story it first appears in, Parsifal goes to visit the Fisher King, who has been injured by what's called the Dolorous Stroke, where he was stabbed in the side with the Spear of Destiny, the spear that pierced the side of Christ. Now, every day, a dove flies down and leaves a communion wafer on the San Gredalis. And by taking that communion wafer, the Fisher King is sustained for another day. It
Right.
doesn't heal his wound, but it keeps him alive. When Percival sees this whole procession, he's supposed to ask, whom does the Grail serve? But earlier in the story, he had been cautioned against asking too many questions, so he keeps his mouth shut and he fails the quest. This is the extent of the description that the original story gives of the Grail. It is
So the
not
Holy
the
Grail is
perfect
actually
story.
Arthur's or Jesus' dinner plate, not not his
Well,
cup.
it's maybe not even Jesus's, because the story doesn't say that it was anything owned by Christ or that it was anything that held Christ's blood. It's just this dish that all communion wafer is left on.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
The thing
not
about
even
Parsifal, though, is it's an unfinished story.
right.
And other authors came in later and tried to finish it. And when they tried to finish it, they expanded on the Holy Grail. It becomes a stone, it becomes a cup, it becomes the cup that was used at the Last Supper.
Mm.
It becomes this cup that Joseph of Arimathea uses to catch the blood of Jesus. And all this stuff gets added in by later writers. It's not part of the Christ story. It's not even part of the original Holy Grail story, and it's certainly not a part of the King Arthur story.
Yeah,
The one
we owe so much to the Middle Ages in terms of their fanciful tales.
This is true. One
The
interesting
same way with
argument.
Robin Hood. Robin
Yep.
Hood never originally fought King John or had anything to do with Richard. He was just some local bandit that used to get one over on the bumbling local sheriff. You know, that was pretty much the extent of the stories. Was just how Robin hoodwinked, the sheriff in this way, or how Robin stole this thing, and got away with it. All these silly little stories. And then later, the medieval historians and writers and stuff started
Yeah,
putting
adding
Robin,
to the story.
and putting him
Oh,
into historical events like Richard and King John and all that.
the other thing that's really interesting to me, just reading about the history of the time periods, if you
Mm.
actually study a little bit about him, King John was not a bumbling idiot at all.
Oh, not at all.
He was
No,
actually an incredibly shrewd, good king for England who had two.
he did. He tried. Yeah, he was in a really bad set of circumstances, and he made a couple of really poor decisions.
A lot of which aren't even his fault, though, because here's what happens.
Hmm.
King Richard is very popular. He is seen as the symbol of chivalry and everything that a knight is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And he runs off to go on crusade
Hmm.
over and over again, which
Yep.
means John's the only one left in the country to run the country. He makes he's actually a very smart guy. He writes a lot of highly respected legal commentary at the time.
Hmm.
He fights a few battles of his own in France and does pretty well with them. I mean, he isn't a frontline commander. Richard was a frontline fighter. He didn't just sit in the back and tell people what to do. He fought.
Oh yeah.
John was a strategist. He played chess with
Well, because
actual forces essentially.
yeah, well, because you got to remember, originally John was like the the fourth son
Yeah,
of the king. He was pretty much supposed to just go into the church and live out his life
yep.
as a bishop or something, because all of his
That's
other
what you do with your
brothers,
youngest kid when especially
yeah,
when you're nobility.
all of his other brothers were expected to inherit, before he would. And I mean, they called him John Lackland specifically because there was
He
like
wasn't
nothing
having
for him to
land.
inherit
Yeah,
when when he was born. Henry had to go and like kind of fuck around and give him Ireland and
yeah.
other places and stuff just to try to give him something.
But a lot of what his problem, at least from what I understand, is Richard goes off on crusade,
Yeah,
gets captured,
on his way
gets
back.
taken hostage, and John has to raise the money to get him out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then it happens again, and it happens again, and it drains the funds, and he has to tax the nobility, which is what pisses everybody off
Yeah.
because he keeps
Well,
having
it
to
actually
bail
wasn't
his
Richard.
brother out of jail, essentially.
Yeah, Richard only actually got captured and ransomed once. The problem was that it was an exorbitant ransom because the
Yeah,
guy holding Richard really hated his guts and wanted to really get all he was worth. So there was that, and then when Richard did get free and come home, he pretty much spent all his time going around to his barons and raiding their
yeah.
castles to steal their money so that he could afford to go back on crusade. He was
Because as
kind of
much
a
as
prick.
everybody loves Richard, he wasn't that great a king.
Oh, he was a terrible king.
And I
Yeah,
think a lot of
he
the
was a
problem
bastard.
historically essentially comes down to Richard was a jock. He was the big flower of chivalry who went out on crusade and fought in the name of God to save the world for Christianity.
Yeah,
And John was a nerd who stayed home and studied law and ran the country like a bureaucrat.
yeah,
He was actually a fairly adept king at the job of being a king, but he forever had, aside from, yeah, he did make some less than brilliant decisions at times.
yeah,
He
and
also forever lived in his
he did
brother's
lose a
shadow.
lot of military battles to King Philip of France. But
And
King
he won
Philip
a
of
few
France
too.
happened to be one of the best kings they
Yeah.
ever had, so he was a little outmatched.
Yeah. And again, a fair amount, all sorts of other issues with Richard running off on crusade over and over and over again. And
Yeah,
that's what he didn't want. Richard didn't want to rule England. He wanted to go out and fight.
yeah. And around the time of John actually inheriting the crown
Mhm.
legitimately, his barons were kind of getting restless and looking to stage uprisings and whatnot to pressure the king into giving them more freedom and taxing them less and all of that. So
Which leads us into the Magna Carta, the formation of the Magna Carta,
yeah,
which I think is another reason he gets more. Again, I'm not saying John was the greatest guy ever, but I think he gets more hate than he deserves. And
oh
again,
yeah,
I think that the difference of being the bookish nerd to Richard's jock and being pushed into the Magna Carta would be a large part of why.
oh yeah. That definitely hurt his reputation. Although his later successors would actually give up a lot more ground in terms of royal power than what he did. The original Magna Carta wasn't that big a limitation on the king's power. It was just the fact that it was the first, and the fact that they dared impose any limits on the king's power was a big
Yeah.
deal.
It also just makes me think of there's an episode of the original series of Doctor Who that suggests an interesting take on the whole idea that John actually wanted the Magna Carta to go through on some level because and then in reality, all the problems they had aside, at least the episode of Pines, he had the military forces to quash the uprising. He chose not to.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think
Uh,
that was. I don't think that's historically accurate though, because
it's an
from
interesting idea, but I'm not saying I don't think it's true
yeah, no,
necessarily
because
either.
historically, even after John signed the Magna Carta, about a couple of years later, he went back and tried to nullify it and say that it was completely wrong, and he went to war with his barons again, and they finally defeated him for the last time, and he was forced to actually accept it and abide by it. But yeah, he tried to get rid of it after the
It
first.
is a pretty good serial, but yeah, I'm
Time.
not saying it's true.
Oh yeah, no, there's all kinds of fun what ifs of
Mm,
history and stuff like that. But yeah,
mm.
I just happened to have just watched a whole thing on the Plantagenets and the different kings and what happened during each of their reigns, and it was really pretty interesting and cool.
And for me, that for that matter, next month, the 18th, I start my history degree.
Oh, there you go. So you'll get to learn all that kind of cool
Yep.
stuff.
It's like I'll get. I've picked up bits and pieces over the years, listening and reading things, listening to people. And it's like now I'm going to dig into it myself, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, good luck
And
with that.
the first half of a two-part world civilization class is one of the first classes I'm taking. It's like, yeah, it's one of the core things I have to take for my major is either a two-part course on American civil history or two-part on world history. And even the advisor was like, yeah, most people just take them both. So I figured I'll start with world history and then I'll do American history later. Although I'm also doing a class specifically dedicated to World War II as well.
Cool.
Yep, I'm extremely excited. But and it's a thing. And there are memes about this all the time. But I'll say this, folks, I'm 46 and I'm going back to school. It's not too late for anybody. And I encourage people to, if you want to go back to school, if you want to learn something new, go do it. I don't care how old you are. Run with it. You never know what you can do until you try. And that's today's uplifting message from Paranormal Encyclopedia.
Yeah. So let's see.
Arthur.
Yeah. 1210.
Mhm.
The let's see, what's the guy's name?
I'm not sure, so this is on you.
There's a 13th century romantic prose novel novels called the Vulgate Cycle,
Hmm.
which are also known as the Lancelot Grail Cycle. And they're a series of 5 Middle French prose works written in the first half of the century. And basically, they were the first time someone tried to combine all of the different Arthurian legends into a coherent story with like a beginning, a middle, and an end, like putting them all into some kind of chronological order and telling the whole story from beginning to end. So that's pretty significant. That was in the early 1200s. And then after that, the next guy who really made a stab at it was good old Thomas Mallory in
Was
his
himself a really interesting figure.
yes, in his very famous La Morte d'Arthur. And that's in the late 15th century. He finally, he did his in English, so that was the first big scale Arthur telling in the English language, and it was so popular that it remained in print. It was one of the first printed books in England, and it stayed kind of the definitive work on Arthur for hundreds of years.
Really, still, I mean, particularly in English, it kind of still is. Most of the other modern depictions of Arthur are derived from Mallory's work.
Yeah,
I mean, the most famous, probably the modern versions, would be The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is heavily influenced by Mallory.
yeah, that and Tennyson.
Yeah, well, yes.
Yeah, the Idols of the King. That's he kind of brought Arthur back into the Victorian era. There was a period of about 200 years or so where the Arthur stories kind of fell out of fashion and people weren't like into them as much anymore. So there wasn't anything significant that happened until the 1800s, where suddenly there was kind of a revival of interest in all those kind of stories and medievalism and romanticism.
It's worth saying, like, again, Mallory himself is a fairly interesting figure.
Yeah.
There's not a lot we know for certain about him. Just looking him up on Wikipedia to refresh my memory about exactly what his deal was. But particularly, I know he even according to his own writing spent a lot of time in prison, and it's at least speculated that his issues with particularly with the Catholic Church and Christianity had a lot of influence on why, in so many ways, Lancelot is kind of the hero of the piece. I
Yeah,
mean, for God's sakes, at the end of the Morte d'Arthur, when Lancelot dies, he gets to go ascend directly to heaven.
yeah. Although that does seem to be in keeping with the kind of romantic tradition that had grown up
True.
over the last couple hundred years, where, like they said, Arthur kind of became more and more of a supporting character in his own
Yeah, and
story.
then Lancelot and the others take center stage.
Yeah, everything's all about them because they're the more dynamic, interesting characters, and Arthur's just kind of this
He's the king. He's the one who
relatively
tells everybody else
bland,
what to do.
yeah, good, decent king, but there's not much to him personally.
Well, it just always bothered me because of Lancelot destroys Camelot because he can't keep it in his pants.
Yeah,
I mean, how much he can't keep it in his pants varies from telling to telling. Because sometimes it may have even been as little as a kiss or an implication without them
yeah,
ever having consummated.
yeah. Oh, also, something I found out: Mordred was not always Arthur's bastard son.
He wasn't even always Arthur's enemy. There,
Yeah, no, in the original Geoffrey of Monmouth, Madrot, or no, the hell was he called in that period? He was like Madredus or
I don't know, to
Mordred
be honest with you.
or Drontus, something like that. But anyway, he was Arthur's. He was the guy that Arthur left in charge when he, get this, was going to march on Rome
Yep.
after having successfully conquered Britain. He marched on Gaul and conquered, took a lot of that, and was preparing to march on Rome when he heard that Mordred had like seized power and married his wife, Guinevere.
And he marches back to
Goes
advice.
back, fights the historic battle with him and Mordred, and they both die.
Well,
Yeah,
there's one of the interesting things. At least in some variation, like some historical speculations, like it's some of the old, based on some of the oldest surviving texts. Some historians think that yes, Arthur lived, yes, Mordred lived, and yes, the Battle of Camlan, the last battle where the two of them die, happened, and they were both at that battle. But there's actually some implication they may have been fighting on the same side
hmm.
against the Saxons or some other enemy, and that all of that stuff comes in later.
Oh, it's certainly possible because it doesn't show up until Geoffrey of Monmouth,
Yeah,
and he could have he's considered by most historians to have just frankly made up a lot of his stuff about Arthur and not necessarily based it on any actual legends or stories that existed at the time. He took certain elements that he liked, but he ignored whole other elements because apparently Monmouth kind of had a thing against the Welsh as a people, didn't
there's
particularly
also
like them. So,
a reality here that I think often gets overlooked that is worth pointing out. That this is the nature of myth, folks.
oh yeah,
Myth and legend and fairy tales are not static things. They change based on the person telling it. They change based on the time period that it's being told and things of that nature. And yes, everyone who comes and tells the story inserts their own biases and their own versions and their own politics into how they tell the story. The Brothers Grimm are a good example in that they wrote down all these folk tales from all over Germany. But all of the stories they're writing are originally German stories. Beauty and the Beast is a French story originally.
hmm.
And several of these other stories come from some of the oldest versions of Cinderella may actually have come from China
Yeah,
along the Silk Road.
and
And these
apparently
stories,
even during their lives, they changed in various editions of their books.
yeah.
Apparently, they rewrote some of the stories and changed elements and
Also,
sanitized or altered
yeah,
part.
the reality is people, anyone who's ever read the original Brothers Grimm version of the stories will tell you they're far darker than what gets told today.
Oh yeah,
That's true, but there's evidence that the original stories the Grimm were drawing from are even darker.
Yeah, probably because the Brothers Grimm at least wanted to try to work some kind of a moral or some kind of dramatic, you know, appropriateness into
Yeah,
their story where the good are rewarded and the
evil are
wicked are
punished.
punished. So they probably had to change
Like
some of the stories in order to do that.
I think in their defense that a lot of the original stories probably had well, not certainly not by modern standards, but at least by the time period of time they were told in some sort of moral to them, because that's kind of the nature of fairy tale and mythology is to push some sort of moral narrative into it. These stories were created to teach people lessons,
Yeah, exactly.
even in the original
Even the
forms
old Greek
before the
god
author. Yeah,
stories.
yeah, authors get involved. But I know, for example, from what I've read, the very earliest versions of the story of Little Red Riding Hood, at the end of the story, the wolf eats grandma, the wolf eats Red, and the story is over. There is no huntsman coming in to cut him open and save the women.
Yeah.
A wolf has his food and goes on his merry way.
Yep.
Um, and a lot of other fairy tales are the same way. It's like, no, this doesn't end pretty. Um, which is also the reality of folk tales and myth are usually not just stories that people told. They're not fiction per se. They're things that people thought actually happened, at least at some point in their history, whether they did or not. The person telling the story thought they were. If you read, for example, the great Arabic version of the Brothers Grimm, Arabian Nights,
Mm,
these aren't just fictional stories to the original author. They're things that were believed to have happened.
yeah.
That people thought there really was a Little Red Riding Hood, or there really was an Aladdin. This might actually be a logical segue from this topic and a good topic for next week: fairy tales,
Sure.
because we are starting to
Fairy
come up
tales
with
and mythology in general.
yeah.
Yeah,
There's
because
so
there's a
much.
lot to cover in that.
Oh, good lord, yes. And just again, there's a really interesting video. I wish I could remember the exact name of it, but you can look it up, and it's one of those expert reacts videos you see all the time. Like Navy SEAL reacts to survival videos, or
Yeah.
sniper reacts to sniping scenes in movies. But it's a mythology expert reacting to mythology in movies and TV.
Oh yeah.
And what I found very surprising, but it makes sense to me, is it kind of his comment at the end of the day is people get all upset because when they make a movie about Hercules or King Arthur, they don't follow the source material. But when people do that, they're forgetting this is storytelling, this is myth. The stories aren't meant to be static. That's not how they've acted all through history. Why do we have this idea now that they have to fit this one form?
Yeah.
And realistically, ladies and gentlemen, I gotta tell you, if you really think that they have to fit a single form, which one?
Hmm.
You know, it was Persephone kidnapped by Hades. Was Persephone given to Hades after she was kidnapped by Zeus? Was Persephone originally a primordial goddess of the underworld who got shoehorned into the Hades story later because the name Persephone in Greek means goddess of the underworld?
Yeah. Well, and as we've seen here, there's no clear like
Yeah,
original Arthur myth. There's no one story that started it all. There's dozens of stories from different cultures that grew in competition to each other or influenced each other and built on each other.
and it's all used as propaganda
Yeah.
throughout history. I mean, Winston Churchill famously said, "If King Arthur didn't live, he should have." because he understood, and lots of other people understood, that whether the story was true or not, there's value in the symbolism, and there's the value of myths is in the story, not in the fact whether it's factual or not.
Oh yeah, the idea that Arthur was taken away somewhere to some magic land and he'll return when England
England
needs
needs it
him.
most.
You know,
Which,
it's like that's an idea that's kept people enthralled for centuries now.
of course, it does beg a giant question. If Arthur's destined to return when England needs him the most, where was he during World War II?
Who knows? Maybe he showed up and was on the receiving end of one of the bombs, and just kind of things didn't go the way they
That's
the way he thought.
or
he
maybe he did
he's
did
there with
show
his
up.
sword ready to go, and all of a sudden, you know,
See, I'm of the opinion he did show up. He did run around the battlefields of World War II with his sword. Whether it was Excalibur or not, we don't know because there's a couple of different magical swords that Arthur owned
yeah,
in
the
various stories.
Excalibur thing actually shows up later.
There
From
is,
he
I know
did
it
have
was,
a magic sword, but it wasn't called Excalibur
yeah,
until a few centuries
later.
later.
I will point out, and as a writer, feel free to take this idea because I think it's worth it. There's a variation of the Arthurian story where Arthur not only he has a magic sword, but it's not called Excalibur. But aside from that, he has a magical talking parrot as a advisor, and that no one has taken this medieval story and turned it into Arthur, King of the Pirates, deeply disappoints me.
Yeah, that or I mean, it makes for the perfect kind of Disney esque animal companion in an Arthur movie. Why haven't we gotten the
Parrot.
talking bird, you know, sitting on his shoulder, voiced by some popular comedian of the day?
We kind of did. It was the Sword and the Stone in Archimedes,
Mm.
and they are actually working on a live action Well, they've been doing it forever, but they are working on a live action version of the Sword and the Stone.
Ah,
They were working on it, and then it got slowed down by COVID.
oh, okay.
Well,
Yeah, I can see them revisiting that one.
that's one thing I find found funny. I found out relatively recently. So the Sword and the Stone is the first, more or less, the first fifth of the novel, the book, The Once and Future King, because it covers Arthur's entire time as king.
Right.
Do you know why they can't make it the entire story, or at least Disney can't, or actually nobody can at the moment?
Doesn't I remember trying to actually read that book when I was younger, and I remember I thought it was really weird and it surprised me because it actually mentioned like a lot of modern
Yeah,
products and stuff, and I think that was part of the whole Arthur or Merlin living backwards
that's when,
thing.
as far as I know, that's when invented the idea that Merlin lives backwards through time.
Yeah, because he has in the Middle Ages they're talking about all this like very modern stuff that he owns,
Yep.
complete with like brand names and stuff. And I
Although
was like,
there's a slightly
wait a
different
minute.
problem that happens.
Okay.
So Disney owns the rights to the first, because it was divided in 5 books. Disney
Oh.
owns the film rights to the first book, The Sword and the Stone.
Mm.
I want to say the fourth book, the second to last book, has also been adapted, and it is the film the rights to adapt to continue to adapt it belong to, I want to say, Rogers and Hammerstein, whoever made, because the musical slash the movie Camelot is also based on the Sword and the Stone, or the
Oh.
Once and Future King. It's just a later part of the novel.
Yeah, that makes sense because that musical came out in 1960,
Yep.
and the T.H. White books were in the late 50s.
So basically, the problem with doing the entire thing is there's a legal kerfuffle over the fact two different companies own the rights to parts of the story. in terms of making adaptations.
Yeah.
Um,
It's as bad as with the James Bond stuff for a while.
mm. But
Given
we should get
given the
going because we're
story.
coming up on the end of our hour, or actually we're over an hour. I'm surprised that we haven't cut off already.
Yeah, we should wrap it up.
But that's going to do it for tonight, folks. Remember to join us next week. We'll be here again, 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Um, Talking about fairy tales and mythology, which will probably be a longer talk than one episode
It
because it's a
might be. Yeah.
big topic.
Yeah.
Um, Also remember
We
check
should
out
see if we can get like a guest on for that.
I
Like
have
maybe,
somebody in mind I'm going to try and reach out to.
yeah, one of your authors.
I should reach out to them too. I have somebody in particular in mind as well, someone who knows far more about Greek mythology than I do.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. It's actually entirely fair of me to say I think she's forgotten more about Greek mythology than I've ever known.